welcome everybody. My name is Bren Carlil and I'm the Director of Public Affairs at the Zionist Federation of Australia. I am delighted tonight to welcome you all to our lockdown learning conversation. We will be joined by Zeddy Lawrence, the editor of the Australian Jewish News, who will be speaking with Ginette Searle, who is the CEO of the Zionist Federation of Australia. Now, Zeddy has been the editor of the AJN since 2009. Prior to taking up this role, he was the editorial director of the Jewish News and Media Group in the UK. And prior to this, he worked at a number of radio stations and also worked for 10 years as a scriptwriter, including for the House of Windsor, Dream Team and EastEnders. Zeddy was educated at St Paul's School in London and the Queen's College, Oxford, where he studied philosophy, politics and economics. And he also received a postgraduate diploma in radio journalism from the London College of Printing, which I'm sure the School of Printing knew a lot about. Now, Ginette Searle is well known to most of you. She has been a leading figure in the Victorian and then national Zionist movement in Australia for many years and is now the CEO of the ZFA, as I mentioned. Before I hand the conversation over to Ginette, just want to remind you all that this time next week, we will be speaking to the former Defence Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, now leading opposition figure. And the week after that, we'll be speaking to the Jerusalem Post editor, Yaakov Katz. In the meantime, we will be speaking with Zeddy. And Ginette, I'll hand the conversation over to you.
So good evening, everybody, and welcome to our ZFA lockdown learning session, whether you're on Zoom with us or whether you're watching on our Facebook live stream. Zeddy, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here with us and to give us a bit of an opportunity to turn the tables, as it were, and ask you for your comments for a change rather than you asking us for our statement. So in 200 words or less, within a short time frame, short deadline, we're going to ask you a few questions. And I've really been looking forward to this chat with you. It's also a chance for everybody watching here to ask some questions as well. And I'm sure many people have a lot of things that they're interested in about the Jewish news and about your role. So please feel free to join the conversation, either by putting your questions or observations into the comment section on the Facebook stream, or if you're on Zoom, straight into the chat function. So Zeddy, you came to Melbourne from the UK, as Bren said, more than 10 years ago, and you're pretty well known to this community already. But let's get to know you a little bit better. What brought you here, first of all?
Well, as Bren mentioned, before I came here, I was the editor of a newspaper in London called The Jewish News, and I've been with that newspaper and the associated website totallyjewish.com for around 10 years. I was 39 years old at the time, and I was looking for to make a bit of a change in my life before my 40th birthday. I thought, before I hit my midlife crisis, I'll try and change my life up a bit. Now, it just so happened that my brother was actually living in Australia at the time. He was the rabbi of the Great Synagogue in Sydney, and it had been a number of years since I'd actually lived in the same country, let alone the same city as my brother. And I hadn't had much of a chance to see him over the years or to see my nephew and my nieces growing up. And so I thought, when the opportunity arose to take the reins of the Jewish News over here, when I was invited to apply for it, I thought, why not? This could be just the kind of change I'm looking for. It'll give me a change of scenery. It'll be a challenge. It'll be something I'm kind of used to, but a bit different. And it'll also be a chance to spend some time with my brother and his family. So the opportunity arose, I was offered the job, and I thought, why not? Let's give it a go. And I'm pleased that I did.
We're pleased too, Zeddy. What were your expectations of our community? And what do you think differentiates us in the Australian Jewish community from the UK Jewish community that you came from?
Well, I must say that when I first came over, I thought it would be identical. I thought the kind of Jews that were over here would be the same. I thought the setup of the community would be the same. I couldn't have been more wrong. Apart from the fact that we all spoke English and that we were all Jewish, it was very different. The first and most noticeable thing that I had to encounter was that I was going to be the editor of two newspapers, the Australian Jewish News in Melbourne and the Australian Jewish News in Sydney. And they're two very separate, very distinct communities with their own identities. I'd been in London, I'd been writing for a national newspaper, and we'd been covering stories from across the country, and people seemed happy with that. Whereas over here, the Sydney people wanted stories about what was going on in the Sydney community, and the Melbourne people wanted stories about what was going on in the Melbourne community. So there was that split there. Another difference I found was that there was a lot more friction, I'd say, between different groups in the community over here than there were over in London. I think one of the differences over in the UK is you're far more used to having anti-Semitism thrust on you from the outside. You're facing a confrontational political system where Israel isn't the flavor of the month. Whereas over here, you've got a general sense of bipartisanship and a lot less anti-Semitism. And when you haven't got people to fight against on the outside, you turn against each other. And I think largely that's what I encountered over here. When I came over here, there was a lot more friction between the different communal organizations. Everybody was fighting their corner. Everybody was a little more political in their endeavors. So whereas over in England, the different groups, whether it was the religious groups, Orthodox versus progressive, or the communal organizations, were prepared to paper over the cracks and fight against the common enemy, the anti-Semites and the anti-Zionists on the outside. Over here, we tend to turn our guns on each other. So you've got schools all competing for the same dollar. You've got the different communal organizations all competing for the same dollar. You've got everybody wanting their inch in the newspaper. And if they see that somebody else has got some coverage in the newspaper, they're furious that they haven't got an equal amount of coverage in the newspaper. Whereas that's something I really didn't encounter when I was over in England. In England, people were just pleased with what they got. And if there were differences between different communal groups, they didn't raise them too much. They just got on with it. We were all Jews together.
That's really interesting, Zeddy. Do you think it's a sign of a strong community, or is it a sign of a fractious and fracturing community?
I think it's both. I think it's a sign that it's a strong community in that it didn't have these threats, these existential threats from the outside. As I often said in the past, the community in England, in a sense, was forced to wear a metaphorical yellow star. They were made to feel Jewish. And as a result of that, they all united, they all bandied together. Whereas over here, because you didn't really have these external political threats, then there wasn't this sense of antagonism from the outside. And so you felt secure enough in yourself that you could be openly Jewish and proud to be Jewish and proud of where you stood in the Jewish spectrum, religiously or depending which organization you were affiliated to. And you felt strong enough that you could challenge the other organizations and it wouldn't undermine the Jewish community as a whole.
And indeed, do you think that's changed in the last 10 years? Is it still as strong, or is it still as vibrant and dynamic as it was then?
I think it's still a very strong and vibrant and dynamic community. One thing that I have noticed over the last 10 years is that if anything, the community over here has become increasingly polarized between the left and the right. And it's something, I mean, you can see it with the foundation of NIF Australia. You can see it with the increasing vocalism of the Australian Jewish Democratic Society in the stand they take when they're criticizing Israel. You can see it in the formation of the Australian Jewish Association, a group of people on the right wing who think that the middle ground is far too left for them and doesn't represent their views. So you've got this polarization there. And it's something I also witness on the letters page each week in the Jewish news, is the language that the people use when they write to each other. There's no sense of we agree to disagree. There's no politeness. There's no courteousness. If you don't agree with somebody's view, then it becomes very personal. You accuse the other person in the letters page. You accuse them of being an idiot or of being a liar. Now that's the kind of language that I then edit out because I want people to argue about the points. I want them to play the ball. I don't want them to play the man. And I find it, I'll be honest with you, I find it quite distressing when I put together the letters page each week, the kind of language that our correspondents are using about each other. I mean, I would love it if there was more tolerance. You know, people would actually discuss the points and they say, oh, I understand what you're saying. I appreciate what you're saying. This is something I can relate to. I just don't agree with it. No. As I said before, when people are writing letters to us, it's this man is a liar or this man is a fool and I cannot tolerate and you should not be giving him a platform to share his views. Now, the fact is people are entitled to have different views, but that's something that we, not just in this Jewish community, I think in the wider community as a whole, we've become increasingly fractured, increasingly polarized in the way that we approach these debates.
Do you think still that the people who are reading the Jewish news, do you think that they're falling on one or other side of those discussions, or do you think that the majority is still somewhere in the moderate centre? I think the majority is still in the moderate centre. Now, obviously, if you're in the Australian Jewish Association, those in the moderate centre are far too much to the left. Or if you're in the AJDS or NIF, those in the moderate centre are too much to the right. But I think the majority of us are in the moderate centre. And I think that a way you can tell that is it tends to be the same people week in, week out who are writing to the Jewish news, either from the left or the right.
And the people in the moderate centre, I think they can perceive that, and they don't write because they're not getting caught up in these debates. They accept that what we as a newspaper are trying to do is tread a moderate middle ground. We're trying to inform people basically just what is going on without taking sides in the debate, and we're allowing people to make their own minds up. And I think that's largely the reason that we don't get vast numbers of people from the centre writing to us, because they can recognise that it is, for want of a better word, they can recognise it is the extremists or the people on the fringe who are dominating the letters pages.
Mm. So in relation to that, Zeddy, I think that there's something very much in common that you have in the Jewish News that we have as the Zionist Federation of Australia, in that we're a community organisation, as you are in some sense. We reflect a constituency of diverse organisations with views from left to right, different streams of Judaism. And there are very definitive views, and we're also trying to walk that tightrope of representing the mainstream. Do you find, I mean, you said before that you're, in a sense, not necessarily presenting a viewpoint, but allowing people to express them. And you said that they seem to be kind of shrieking on the letters pages rather than listening. A question for you, how do you think we as the Zionist Federation or as community organisations, or you as the Jewish News, can encourage a conversation where people listen to each other more, rather than stop and think, what am I going to say next? And how can I rebut every point in this letter that I disagree with just because I know who's writing it and I'm going to disagree with them? Yeah. How do we encourage more open and civilised conversations?
Well, I'm often reminded of the story, and people, if you've heard me tell this before, please forgive me, but I'm reminded of the story of the yeshiva rowing team who decide to challenge the Oxford boat crew to a race. And they have this race and they're beaten by a mile and they can't understand why they've lost. And after the race, all the people from the yeshiva are getting together and they're trying to work out why it is that they've lost this race. And eventually one bright spark from the back of the room says, you know what I've noticed? They have 8 guys rowing and 1 guy shouting. We have 1 guy rowing and 8 guys shouting. And the rabbi thinks for a moment and he says, you know, you're right. We need a stronger rower. And that always reminds me of our community. It's a lot of people shouting, desperate to get their voices heard. And there's a few of us in the middle, whether it's the Zionist Federation, like you say, whether it's the Australian Jewish News, who are just trying to row, trying to keep a steady course and trying to get to the end of the race without capsizing. And I think the thing that I would encourage people to do is just to read the rest of the Jewish News, not just focus on the letters page. Read the rest of the articles, see what the mainstream communal organizations are doing. Grasp the opportunities that are out there to get engaged in the community. I mean, I think one of the incredible things that's happened over the last few months since we've had the lockdown is the resilience and the resourcefulness of the community. I, frankly, when the lockdown started, I thought, this is the end of the Jewish News and this is the end of the community, because how on earth are we going to cope? But there was such resilience and such resourcefulness by the ZFA in hosting events like the Lockdown Learning, and then indeed by all the communal organizations hosting all these video conferences and these video sessions where there's this whole plethora of speakers from across the board who we've never had access to before. And yet now, every night within the community, there's somebody from Israel, somebody from America, somebody from Europe, who we can tune in and listen to, and we can hear what they've got to say. And it's such an incredible opportunity for every individual member of the community. You don't now need to go to Beth Wiseman on a wet and cold night to hear a speaker. Now you can just tune in from your living room or tune in from your study and listen to people from across the political and the religious spectrum, and you can engage with the community like that. So there's far more opportunities now to find out what's going on. There's far more opportunities to just engage with communal organizations and appreciate the brilliance of our community and what it has to offer. Whether you're on the left, whether you're on the right, whether you're in the center, there's something that you can listen to, something you can tune into, something you can watch, and something you can embrace and learn from, and actually realize that, you know, it's not just the fringes who dominate the community. There's so much more going on that we can all enjoy.
Zeddy, you mentioned when we chatted earlier in the week that you had a conversation with Jewish News or Jewish newspaper editors from around the world recently. Was that about coronavirus and the responses to that, or how the communities were coping? And tell us, how are other communities in the international Jewish world managing, and to what extent are we in the same place as they are? I don't mean in numbers of coronavirus infections, but I just mean in terms of our community strength and health, and exactly the things you were talking about, how we're responding.
Yeah, I mean, it was partly about that. It was primarily about how the Jewish press is coping with that. So I can only really relate to that. We'll all have heard the stories from the early days of the coronavirus lockdown about how the Canadian Jewish News folded, they couldn't cope, and how the Jewish News in the UK and the Jewish Chronicle in the UK went into liquidation. Ultimately, they were saved, but they went into liquidation. And I'll admit to you, I was petrified that just a few days into coronavirus, that we would go the same way as a newspaper. I couldn't see how we could actually run a newspaper. For 20 years of my life, I've been in a newsroom. I've been liaising with other journalists. I've been liaising with production staff. I've been liaising with other editors. We talk face to face. We discuss things. We have pieces of paper in our hand where the pages of the newspaper are printed out, and we can say, this has to be changed, that has to be changed, when we're pointing to physical things. So I didn't understand how physically we'd be able to cope with putting a newspaper out. And then I didn't have a clue, as I said before, how the community would survive. I thought there'll be a few stories about how the community has been impacted by coronavirus. There'll be some stories about the charitable work that's going on within the community to help people who are suffering as a result of the impact of the lockdown. And that'll be it. That'll be the end of the news cycle. We'll have nothing else to report on, and we won't be able to practically report on anything. How wrong I was, because as I said before, the community has been so resilient in the way it just immediately bounced back from what could have been cataclysmically devastating. You know, every day the shuls were hosting events. You couldn't necessarily go to a service if you were Orthodox, but you could go to a Friday evening service before Shabbos came in, and then you could go to a Havdalah service. All these things being carried out on Zoom, on YouTube, on Facebook. The progressive community, obviously, they were able to stream their services so people could engage. People who wouldn't even dream of going to shul previously were now going to shul online. And then all the communal organizations, the ZFA hosting lockdown learning, UIA, JNF, all the other communal organizations hosting things online to ensure that the community kept going and didn't just survive, but thrived. And as I said earlier, I mean, there's just this plethora of events that have been going on. And then beyond that, there was just the news actually continued going. Now, some of the news was connected with the coronavirus, how we as a community have been impacted, the anti-Semitism that has ensued, unfortunately, as a result, the, dare I say, the secret minions that were carried out by certain groups within our community who shouldn't have been getting together to pray, but were still getting together. So you had coronavirus-related news. And then beyond that, you had just general news. The community and the world kept going, and there was still politics going on, and there were still things that we as a newspaper could report on. So I was incredibly surprised and incredibly relieved that we still had things to report on. And going back to your original question, the same seems to have been the case elsewhere around the globe, in communities that have suffered far worse than we've suffered. You know, it's only in the last day or so that the UK is coming out of lockdown. They're still suffering from over about 150 people a day dying. A vast swathe of people within the Jewish community, shockingly, were killed as a result of this. And this is something that the Jewish News and the Jewish Chronicle have reported on. But again, now saved from liquidation, they are still managing to put out newspapers each week covering, yes, the impact of the coronavirus, but also other news that just is going on. The world did not stop as a result of the pandemic. And I think that has been the case elsewhere. The Jewish media discovered it didn't need to be in an office environment to produce Jewish newspapers, and it didn't need to send journalists to events to ensure that there was content to fill the newspapers. It just needed to keep an eye on what was going on, make sure that it was abreast all the different communal events that were taking place online. You know, at the start of this crisis, we got rid of our What's On page because we thought, well, there's going to be nothing going on. But a few weeks into it, we realized, well, hang on, every communal organization is doing stuff every day. And so we brought back the What's On page. And it's the same elsewhere around the Jewish world. The Jewish communities have continued to function just as society has continued to function.
Indeed, indeed. I'll change tack a little bit here, Zeddy, and just talk a little bit about the specific and very unique nature of the Jewish News, or any community newspaper, I suppose. And to do that, I just want to go back in history, way back to when the Jewish News was founded, or its precursors, which from my reading was 1895, a long, long time ago. the Hebrew Standard in Sydney and the Yiddish Aeneas sometime after that in Melbourne. Of course, it was in Yiddish. They really would have had a very particular role as a social connector. It helped people from one side of the river understand what their relatives on the other side of the river were doing and who was engaged to who and what was going on in the world, in the shtetl, if you like. At a time where there was no Facebook and people weren't using the phone so much. Even in my childhood, which isn't as far back as all of that, but it was a long time ago, there was a Mount Scopus Bar Mitzvah Boy of the Week, and there was a photo there, and that's where you caught up with what was going on with people you knew or people you didn't know in the community. It was really about the social content, as well as bringing content about what was happening in the Jewish world and in Israel that people couldn't otherwise get. And that content might have been a week old, but you wouldn't have had it otherwise because it was barely covered in mainstream media. So even looking back as to what the Jewish news or its precursors did in the time, apparently, I thought this was really interesting actually, that the chief rabbi of the great synagogue had his sermon on the front page of the Hebrew Standard every week for 29 years. Now that's phenomenal editorial influence, I think. And I don't know what the editorial policy was in the day, but it would certainly have been driven somewhat by the rabbi's sermon, which probably couldn't happen today. I'm sure things have changed in the Jewish news as much as they've changed in society generally. But the Jewish news still remains a newspaper for the community. It's an outlet for news, but it's also an outlet for news about us and for us. How do you maintain, you're sitting there as the editor, how do you maintain the balance, keeping your readership and your editorial board happy with the sort of things that you're putting in the paper?
It's interesting, as you just said, in the olden days, the rabbi's sermon used to be what was on the cover of the newspaper. Nowadays, if a rabbi discovers they're going to be on the front page of the Jewish news, they're absolutely terrified. They think, oh my God, what have they found out about me? But no, I mean, it is a challenge. We do still try and carry that traditional role of being, telling people what their cousins across the river are doing. There's still the story. There are still stories that are about the nicer things that are going. You mentioned there used to be the Mount Scopus Bar Mitzvah Boy of the Week. We still have a Simcha of the Week in the newspaper where we highlight one particular Simcha that's going on, whether it's a Bar Mitzvah or a Bat Chayil or whatever, or a marriage or an engagement. But yes, it is trying to find that balance between what is news and what is just PR for the community. Now, we, on any given day, get any number of press releases by communal organizations trying to get us to push events that they've got coming up. They think this is the biggest news that we can tell people in the community is they've got so-and-so speaker or they've got so-and-so fundraiser going on. And we have to make a decision each week. Does this eclipse other things that are going on in the community? Debates that are happening in Parliament, grants that are being given to communal organizations, anti-Semitism that is going on within our midst. And some weeks there is more of that and other weeks there is less of that. And it's something that we sit down on a Monday morning with a list of all the stories that have come our way, whether it's a press release about a swastika that has been daubed on the outside of a synagogue, or whether it's a press release from UIA or JNF or, I need to mention them all now, they'll be upset, ZFA, NCJWA, WITSO, Magen David Adom. If it's a press release from one of them about an event that they've got coming up, saying that we've got so-and-so speaker or we're holding such and such a charitable event, and we have to decide what is actually the most newsworthy thing to put in the newspaper. And we try and draw a balance. We want to have a certain amount of good news, positive, this is our community, get involved, look at all the wonderful events that are going on. We want to have a certain amount of that in the newspaper to encourage participation and to get people engaged and actively involved in the community. But on the same time, we are a newspaper. We're no longer the newspaper of 50, 60, 70 years ago, where if somebody went on holiday, Mr. Cohen from Caulfield has gone to America to visit his sister, that would have been a story in the newspaper. And people would have read, oh, Mr. Cohen's gone on holiday. And, nowadays you think, how on earth was that news? But that was news back in the day. Nowadays, there are far more, dare I say, serious stories that need to be addressed. Israel for better or for worse, has become such a newsworthy topic, not only in the Middle East, but across the world and here in Australia. Our political parties debate it. You know, at ALP national conferences, the most discussed foreign affairs policy will be, what is our policy towards Israel? Whatever else is going on in the world, there are more motions to do with Israel than any other country. And these are things that we need to reflect, and these are things that we need to address as a newspaper. Unfortunately, over recent years, there's been a spike in anti-Semitism, whether it's just a swastika graffitied somewhere, as I said earlier, or whether it's somebody actually being physically assaulted in the street. These are real, sad, tragic news stories that we as a newspaper have to address. And I'll give you an example just from this week. You know, Pete Evans, the celebrity chef, recently, or just last week, did a podcast with David Icke, who is a known anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist from Britain. Now, I'm sure that in their conversations, Pete Evans wasn't discussing David Icke's view on Holocaust denial or his view that Rothschild Zionists control the world. They have a shared interest in the coronavirus and the impact that the establishment of 5G towers has on the coronavirus. But the simple fact that Pete Evans, who is a known celebrity over here, is giving a platform to somebody like David Icke is quite shocking, because Pete Evans has a lot of followers. No, he's no longer the presenter of My Kitchen Rules, but he's still a celebrity over here. He has a lot of people who tune into his podcast. And if somebody who's listening to it hears the name David Icke and thinks, oh, this David Icke sounds like an interesting fellow, let's see what else he's written, and then starts reading that David Icke denies the Holocaust, or that David Icke thinks that if Schindler's List is being shown in schools, then also Holocaust denial material should be taught in schools. If somebody is reading that as a result of Pete Evans' podcast, then it's something that we as a community need to be concerned about, and we need to act upon it. And this was actually a case in point to do with what you were discussing earlier. We had a hole in the newspaper on Wednesday morning, which is when we finished the newspaper, and we had to make a decision. Do we put the David Icke story in there, or do we put another story we have to do with what one of our communal organizations is doing? And we thought to ourselves, you know what, this David Icke story is important, it's happening now, it's something that will actually affect us. The story about what the communal organization is doing, it's still doing it next week, it's not going to be out of date. And so we made that decision. We'll go for the newsy, hard story, as it were, rather than the softer, isn't our community wonderful story.
Interesting one. Let's just, you mentioned Israel, so let's focus on Israel for a while. Do you think our community has changed over your time here in its views and its attention to Israel?
I think the community has changed in its attention to Israel, not necessarily, for two reasons. First of all, as I said earlier, I think society as a whole has become more polarized, and I think our Jewish community has become more polarized. And so we have more extreme views on Israel, not extremist views, but extreme views on Israel. And we're more willing to fight our corner, depending where we stand. So if we're on the left, we're going to be more critical of Israel. If we're on the right, we're going to be more defensive of Israel. I think various things, though, have also happened within Israel that have helped polarize views. I think one is the longevity of Benjamin Netanyahu, who is a very, very polarizing character. And I think the fact that he has been in power for so long, and a lot of people have a problem with him as prime minister. A lot of people see him, well, let's face facts, he's being charged with corruption and breach of trust and all manner of things. And a lot of people don't think he's a reputable leader for the country. A lot of people, on the other hand, think he's the best leader that Israel could have. They see him as a strong statesman-like person who's prepared to stand up to Israel's enemies. So I think he himself is a polarizing character. I think various things have happened in terms of the peace process, the fact that that has stalled and doesn't seem to be progressing, whether it's as a result of Benjamin Netanyahu's stance, whether it's as a result of the Palestinian stance. I think the fact that that has stalled means people are taking increasingly polarized views on the peace process, who they want to blame for it, why it has stopped. We've seen a global discussion about whether the two-state solution itself is dead. And a lot of people out there nowadays think that the two-state solution is dead and are trying to look for alternatives to that. And that is polarizing. And just in the last few weeks, we've had discussion about annexation. And that is polarizing. Some people think annexation, best possible thing. The peace process has stalled. It's time for Israel to set its borders. Israel is being accused of occupation. It can't get out of occupation because it's got nobody to negotiate with. So let's do what we did with Gaza a few years ago. Let's take unilateral action. Let's move things forward. Let's say this is going to be Israel's boundaries, and then we'll push the debate forwards. A lot of people think that's a terrible move. They think that's a blow to the peace process. They think it's an infringement on Palestinian rights. They think that it's a terrible example of Benjamin Netanyahu's arrogance. They think it's a sign of what's going on under Netanyahu with Trump's blessing. And so I think there are these polarizing incidents within Israel and within society itself that have helped cause this divergence in views on where we stand on the Jewish state. Now, as a newspaper, we accept that people are entitled to have different views, and we don't try and dictate this is the right view or this is the wrong view. We just try and educate people. We try and present a variety of opinions, and we try and let our readers make up their own mind. We say, for example, on the issue of annexation, as we did in the editorial this week, we said, you know, you can be for it or against it, but wherever you stand on it, you should be concerned. Now, you should be concerned either that it's going to be infringing on Palestinian rights and it's a blow to the peace process, or if that's not your concern, you should be concerned that it's going to increase Israel's isolation overseas. And if that's not your concern, you can at least recognize that there's going to be an increased threat of violence from within the West Bank, from Hamas, and also threats from Hezbollah trying to take advantage of this great action that Israel is taking. So whatever your views, recognize that it's an issue to be concerned about, but try and study, try and learn, try and understand what the different viewpoints are. And that's something, to be fair, that is something you can get from reading the AJN letters page each week, because for the last few weeks, it's been dominated by debates on annexation, people on the left and people on the right. And that's something also that's been carried into the newspaper. Now, in this instance, it seems to be the left of the community that has taken the lead. 3 weeks in a row, we had a number of communal organizations on the left writing to the government, stating that the government should take a stand against annexation. And I apologize to those of you who don't recognize that annexation is the right word to use in this context, who think it's extension of sovereignty. I'm just using it as shorthand because that is the terminology that a lot of people are using. But I'm not saying that I necessarily subscribe to that terminology. So we had the movement, we had the left-wing organizations writing to the government. We also had youth movements coming out against, 3 youth movements on the left coming out against annexation and urging the community to take a stand against it. So the movement here has been on the left, and we have reported that in the newspaper. And the following week, we've had letters on the letters page from people challenging that. And we haven't tried to dictate this is right or this is wrong. We've just tried to present a balanced viewpoint and let our readers make up their own mind on it.
Indeed, and I think at this point, and certainly the position that the Zionist Federation has taken, is that until a plan is actually on the table, we're really also talking about information analysis. You know, keep yourself informed. People can make their own minds up, but we can also make our own mind up once there is a position to be assessed, I suppose. And I think that was reflected in your front page this week as well. So that Israel probably does take up a lot of your time, and a lot of our time, of course. That's what we do too. But let's move to, I guess, the community as well. Where do you see the role of the Jewish News in bringing issues that might be under the radar to light? In the past, you've brought to light some very serious issues in our community, exposure of sexual abuse within the Jewish community. Would you like to talk to us a little bit about how some of those issues have evolved and unfolded, and what you see as the newspaper's responsibility as a community organisation, also as news media, to bring our community to account?
Yeah. Well, I've got to say, first off, I think our coverage of child sexual abuse from the get-go has been one of the proudest achievements I've had, and I think along with my journalists who've done a fantastic job in bringing that to light over the years and the cover-ups that have occurred within the community. I think that's been my proudest achievement while I've been at the Jewish News. Now, obviously, a lot of people think that we shouldn't be washing our dirty linen in public. And when we first raised the issue, I think it was back in 2011, when we revealed that a certain rabbi within the community had been sending emails to other rabbis saying that we shouldn't report child sexual abuse to the police, but we should try and deal with it ourselves and not let it get into the public. When we first reported that back in 2011, there were a lot of people in the community who said we shouldn't be broadcasting this. This was dirty linen, it shouldn't be washed in public. We got tremendous backlash from the Rabbinic Council of New South Wales, who it was actually their president at the time who had written these emails. And they thought that we had committed such lashon hara, and it was a chilul Hashem that we had called for this rabbi to resign from his position for sending these emails. And at the time, we were actually shocked that not one communal organization publicly came out in support of the Jewish News. Behind closed doors, a couple of people said, yeah, well done, yes, he should go. But publicly, not one person actually stood by us and said, yes, this rabbi must stand down. What he's saying is an absolutely terrible thing. It's against the law and has no accord with Jewish principles whatsoever. 4 years on, following the Royal Commission, every one of those organizations turned around and said, you know what, you were right at the time. We wish we'd spoken out at the time, because had we spoken out at the time, maybe this wouldn't have come out in such a terrible way and cast such a shadow over the Jewish community. So I was tremendously proud of the lead we took in exposing the attempts to cover up child sexual abuse. And it continues to this day. Obviously, we're still campaigning to have Malka Leifer brought back from Israel to face the charges, 74 charges in connection with child sexual abuse and rape at the Adass Israel school. And that is something now the entire community has got behind. The Zionist Federation of Australia is a key campaigner also, and is also speaking out on behalf of Malka Leifer's alleged victims and urging that she be brought home. And even more than that, we're actually finding that our communal organizations, whether it's the ZFA, whether it's the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, whether it's the Australia-Israel Jewish Affairs Council, are actually being critical of Israel and critical of the way that Israel has handled the judicial process over there, and are shocked by the circus that has become the attempts to extradite Malka Leifer. So we've come so far from where we were just 9-10 years ago, where people wanted it all hushed up, and now people are actively campaigning for child sexual abuse perpetrators or alleged perpetrators to be brought to justice. And not only are they campaigning for that, they're actually being critical of the way that Israel is handling that. And how many subjects, how many topics do we find our community being critical of Israel on? So few from the main communal organizations. So the fact that they're prepared to take such a vocal stand on this, I think, is absolutely tremendous.
Yeah, and of course, it's the right thing to do.
It's the right thing to do. But 10 years ago, 11 years ago, you mentioned Malka Leifer, and it was all, let's not go there. Let's not go there. It's an embarrassing thing. It's terrible that this has happened. Let's just try and sort it out quietly. Now it's on the front page of the Jewish News. It's on the front page of other newspapers. There are television programs made about it, and it's fantastic that we all have the courage now to be so open about these affairs, whereas a few years ago we didn't want it discussed at all.
Zeddy, I'm going to jump to audience questions because we just are overrun with questions actually. So apologies in advance if we don't get to your questions during this session. We have a question about British politics from Jack Craypot, who asks, were you surprised at the effectiveness of the campaign of the British Jewish community against Jeremy Corbyn and his leadership of the British Labour Party in the lead up to the 2019 election? That's something.
Was I surprised by the effectiveness? Absolutely not. What I can't believe is how it took so long for the rest of the country to realise what a terrible human being Jeremy Corbyn is, what the double standards he has. Had any other community, be it the black community, the Muslim community, the gay community, gone to Jeremy Corbyn and said, you know what you're saying offends us, we are shocked by it, please apologise, and please don't encourage it or foster those sentiments within your party, Jeremy Corbyn would have bent over backwards to appease them and to side with them. And yet the Jewish community, he just could not relate to the anti-Semitism that he personally was spouting and that he was encouraging within the party. And so I fully commend the Jewish community, my own previous newspaper, the Jewish News, the Jewish Chronicle, the Board of Deputies over there, every single member of the Jewish community who marched and tried to point out the hypocrisy and the double standards and the anti-Zionism and the anti-Semitism of Jeremy Corbyn. They are to be commended, and the people who resigned from the Labour Party over it are to be commended. What is so shocking and so devastating is that Jeremy Corbyn was able to be the leader for so long. Every week there was yet another revelation of some anti-Semitic incident that he was involved in, whether it was standing shoulder to shoulder with a Holocaust denier, whether it was standing shoulder to shoulder with somebody who called for the state of Israel to be eradicated, whether it was praising a mural or defending a mural that was blatantly anti-Semitic, whether it was writing the forwards to a book which claimed that Jews basically ran the global banking system and controlled the world. Jeremy Corbyn every day was revealed to be an anti-Semite. And yet, like a Teflon frying pan, nothing stuck. And the only people who could see this were the Conservative Party over in England who were campaigning against him, and the Jewish community, and some very decent people within the Labour Party. But otherwise, there was this blindness to him and what he actually stood for. He was seen as this cuddly character, this elderly old fogey who, yes, he campaigned on behalf of social justice, and that's all very nice, and he was against racism, but that's all very nice. But society as a whole and the Labour Party as a whole were blind to just how pernicious he was as a human being. And thank God he's gone now. Thank God there are now signs that the Labour Party in Britain has turned a corner. And we can only hope that it continues to go that way. So was I surprised by the effectiveness of the community's response to him? Absolutely not. I was surprised by just how long it took to finally get him out of power.
Yeah, and thank goodness they achieved what they did in the community. Next question from Emily Gian. Who'd be interested to know if there's any story that's come across your desk about something in the community that is just off limits to print. Now, because it's off limits to print, it might be off limits to say too, but I guess she's digging for dirt here. Zeddy, have you got anything you can say there?
I can say that there are stories that we have not printed, because when we've done our due diligence on stories, we have come to the conclusion that what is being pushed towards us is a personal gripe or personal gripes from individuals within the community, rather than necessarily widespread feeling about the wrongs of certain organizations. I'm trying to tread very carefully here. But yes, we often get complaints about communal organizations from people who are members of those organizations or are somehow connected to those organizations. And we have to weigh up, is this a genuine story, or is this just somebody with an axe to grind? And after we have done a lot of research into it and asked a lot of questions, there are occasions where we decide this is simply somebody with an axe to grind and this isn't a genuine story. So are there stories that are just too dirty for us to handle? I'd say no. I mean, the fact that we touched the fact that we covered child sexual abuse, the way that last year Rebecca Davis's stories on bullying at non-Jewish schools, the easiest thing would have been to say, no, we're not going to get involved in that. It's just too difficult for us to cover. But no, we do our homework. And if we think that this is a story that needs to be told and has to be told, then we will tell that story.
We've got a couple of questions here about the Jewish news and the younger generation. And I guess it goes back to earlier conversation about social media, about people getting their news from any number of sources, from Twitter, from Facebook, looking at the feed that comes into their personal feed, which reflects their own point of view, shouting into their own echo chamber. Probably something for the whole community, but possibly even more so the younger generation. To what extent are you maintaining success, or are you able to engage with the younger generation more, especially because they don't go to the Jewish news to find out about engagements and weddings anymore?
I think we face the challenge that every newspaper faces now, which is just generally most people just don't get their news from newspapers. They get their news from, like you say, from Facebook or from other social media, whether it's Instagram or Twitter. I have to say, though, that we have a very successful Facebook page and a very successful website. Last year, we appointed a new digital editor, Evans Latkis, who had previously been with the newspaper and then left and then came back. And nowadays, if we post something online, the Jewish News is a newspaper that comes out once a week. Facebook and our website are things that can be updated and are updated every hour or every couple of hours. And every couple of hours, there will be a new post on our website or on Facebook that Evan has found, whether it's something that's appeared already in the newspaper or whether it's a new story that's breaking. We recognize that we need to be at the forefront. We need to be breaking news as and when it happens, because by the time we come out on a Thursday morning or a Thursday afternoon, whatever we're writing about could be a week old. So Evan is there, and his job is to get it out there immediately, as soon as possible, get the comments. And then what appears in the newspaper the following week will be an updated version of what he's had on the website when the story has broken. And the posts that we post, they are getting 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 people looking at them, 20,000 people in some instances. And we're tremendously proud of the work we're doing in that field, just as every communal organisation should be proud in the last few weeks of how they've adapted to social media and embraced that as a way forward. It's something that we decided a year or so ago we needed to take seriously, and that's what we're doing. How that will impact on the newspaper moving forwards is something that I think we and every other newspaper is waiting to see. The fact is, people still do buy the Jewish news every week. There are still some people who want to know who's got engaged and who's been born and who unfortunately has passed away that week. And there are people out in our community who aren't on Facebook every day, or who aren't looking at the Times of Israel or the Jerusalem Post or Ynet every day. So there are people who still come to our newspaper for a general roundup of what's going on in the Jewish world and what's going on in Israel, because they're not clued in to social media as the rest of us are. They're not clued in to the Jewish press online as the rest of us are. And then there are stories that are exclusive to the newspaper. We do decide, this is something we're going to keep for the newspaper. It's going to be new for us. We can do a big expose on it, something that you can't necessarily do on Facebook. So when it is something like bullying in schools or sexual abuse, or the story that we had last week where it was the survey into gender discrimination within our communal organisations, we decided, you know what, we're going to break it in the newspaper, and then we're going to put all the details and all the graphs and all the information online. So we're driving traffic between one platform and another. So it's a balancing act, trying to decide what are you going to put online, what are you going to put in the newspaper. But we recognise that, like every newspaper does, it's a challenge, and we have to adapt, and it's something we're trying to do, and time will tell how successfully we do it. But at the moment, we're very proud of our online presence, and we hope that it will continue.
I'm only sorry that we're not going to have more time to really get into the issue of gender discrimination and that whole expose that you did, because that in itself is a full hour discussion. Maybe that's something for another time. Zeddy, normally at the end of the Jewish year, before Rosh Hashanah, and at the end of the calendar year in December or beginning of January, the Jewish News does the year-end review. It's a very strange year, 2020. I think most of us will look at 2020 and say, let's just rule that one out. Let's just move on to 2021 and hope that's better. If I ask you, Zeddy, please, it's just after the 30th of June. Give us a half year in review. What are the big stories? What's the big deal from the first half of the year? I know we're all thinking about Corona, but there is news other than Corona. Yep. And what do you predict as the big issues for our Jewish community and for you as a reflection of that between now and the end of December?
Well, yeah, as you say, it's all about coronavirus at the moment. It's all about the lockdown. People will have forgotten that 7 months ago, there was only one news story on everybody's lips, and that was the bushfires, which engulfed Australia. Mm-hmm. And, our 6 month in review begins with the bushfires and the impact that had, not just on Australia, but on the Jewish community. And as a newspaper, we found Jews in far-flung communities in places you wouldn't have thought existed, who were affected by the bushfires, whose homes were burnt down, whose businesses were destroyed as a result of the flames engulfing the towns in which they lived. But it wasn't just the Jews who were impacted directly by the bushfires. We found Jewish fire officers, Jewish police officers, Jewish rabbis who travelled to the scene, who were all caught up in fighting these bushfires. And then there was the community response as a whole, the fundraising that went on both in New South Wales and in Victoria. Millions of dollars were raised by the Jewish community to help rebuild bushfire-ravaged communities. That was the start of the year. Yeah. The next big story that I think impacted not just on the community, but particularly on the Australian Jewish News, was the death of Joshua Levi, who had been a colleague of mine for 10 years. He'd been a senior journalist. He indeed was the journalist who was most involved in the child sexual abuse revelations over the years, covering those for the newspaper. In the last 2 years, he had been the chief executive of the company, and then tragically, at the age of 36, just a few days after becoming a father, he passed away, which was a shock to everybody at the Jewish News and the entire community because he was so well connected and so well respected. That was the second big story, I'd say, of the year. The third one, just a few moments later, a few days later, Reuven Rivlin, the president of Israel, was visiting Australia. And that, of course, is a huge thing for our community. And he was welcomed here with open arms, not just by our community, but by the political echelons. And we had some lovely pictures of him cuddling koalas and shaking hands with Scott Morrison and meeting all sorts of people and opening the stock exchange. And that was wonderful. And then suddenly, shockingly, there was a big question mark. Will Reuven Rivlin be able to go home? Because no sooner was Reuven Rivlin destined to get on a plane to go back to Israel than Israel shut its borders because of the coronavirus. And there was a big question, will he be allowed to go home? Will he have to go into quarantine? Now, as luck would have it for him, he was allowed to go home, but no sooner had Reuven Rivlin left our shores than we suddenly went into lockdown. And that, I think, has largely dominated our lives for the last three or 4 months. And, you know, I think then, so the next big story then after Reuven Rivlin's visit is just how the community adapted and reacted to the lockdown, to the pandemic, and then the impact it had worldwide and on Jewish communities worldwide. I mean, we mentioned before the United Kingdom, that was just one of a number of countries where there were a disproportionate number of Jews who died as a result of the virus. So I'd say those were the principal things that dominated the first 6 months of the year. Looking to the next few months of the year, I think we've touched on one of those. That is annexation. What will happen in Israel? Will Benjamin Netanyahu get his way and annex part of the West Bank or extend Israeli sovereignty over part of the West Bank? How will that play out internationally? How will that play out back home, where both the government and the opposition now have spoken out and urged the Israeli government not to annex this territory? So that, I think, is going to be a big story over the next few weeks. And then I think the thing that will take us through to the end of the year is the American election and just what's going to happen there. Now, I think a lot of people, obviously, within our community think that Donald Trump is the best thing that's ever happened to Israel. And to an extent, they could be right. He's certainly been the most pro-Israel president, I think, that the country has ever experienced. He moved the embassy to Jerusalem. He's given Benjamin Netanyahu such leeway to defend the country. He's come forward with this peace plan, which is would certainly benefit Israel in a number of ways. But I think the coronavirus has shown Donald Trump up to not be quite the person a lot of people were hoping that he would be, and has shown him to be even more of a loose cannon than they thought he would have been. And I think a lot of people who may have been tempted to vote for Trump previously may now be having second thoughts. So I think it really is an open race. And whereas once, you know, as the incumbent and as the pro-Israel candidate, he was obviously an automatic choice for us to want to get him into the White House, particularly when he's facing somebody like Joe Biden, who has not got the best credentials as far as Israel is concerned in his own political life or as Barack Obama's vice president. I think a lot of people would be thinking, despite all that, is Donald Trump really the man that we want to be running the world? So I think that is going to be one of the big stories that dominates the headlines, both in the Jewish news and indeed the wider news as we head towards the end of the year.
Definitely, definitely. It's going to be an interesting year. And of course, coronavirus will cast the shadow over all of that, I assume. Who knows what's going to happen there. We've got a question here from a frequent letter writer to you, Zeddy. Michael Bird is asking, everyone has a bias. Is it possible for an editor to hide, for any editor to hide his or her bias?
I don't think it's only possible for an editor to hide his bias. I think an editor has to hide his bias. And I think Michael knows full well that my sympathies don't necessarily lie with everything that he stands for, but he will also acknowledge that as often as possible, I will publish his letters in the newspaper, and I will often engage with him and explain to him why certain things that he's written can't be published in the newspaper, and I will work with him to rewrite certain sections of his letters to ensure that they are published in the newspaper. And that's something I always try and do on the letters page, and I think Michael would testify to that. I will try and get as much balance in the newspaper as possible. The only bias I have, I would say, is to try and be moderate and to try and tread a middle line between those on the left and those on the right, so that there isn't bias in the newspaper, so that everybody does have an equal say, and so that there is a balance. The one bias I would say that does creep in is the platform of the newspaper, which is that we are a pro-Jewish Zionist newspaper. We will not give a platform to people, for example, who would call for Shechita to be banned or call for Brit Milah to be banned. We will not give a platform to people who would call for the state of Israel to be dismantled or destroyed. We would actively encourage publication by letters, though, from anybody who would consider themselves to be Zionist. If you believe in the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state, then we will publish your letters and we will publish your views. And likewise, if you are in favor of Judaism as religion, whether as a secular Jew or as an Orthodox Jew, as a progressive Jew, we will give you a platform within our newspaper. So the only bias apart from those lines is to try and be balanced and to try and not let one side of the debate, be it the left or the right, dominate the argument within the newspaper.
Similar, as I said before, similar to us in a sense of the importance of inclusivity and of listening to all points of views, but obviously having red lines where things just are not for publication, I guess, things that are off the table.
Off limits.
Zeddy, you're in a very, very unique position. I think it's really been wonderful to talk to you, because you sit with a perspective of seeing what makes our community tick. People, as you said, they're writing media releases to you and statements to you, and I'm sure you're getting people calling you with hot tips for stories or important stories that you should be telling. If your life in the community is anything like mine, you can't go to Coles or to Glicks without people telling you what to say, what you should be writing about, how you should be saying it, and which page of the paper it should actually be appearing. And my comment should have been above his comment when you reported it. Thank you very much. So I understand it's a stressful job, and on top of all that, you have deadlines that can't be missed. You can't say, oh, we've got Corona this week, we're going to get the paper out 3 days later. It doesn't work, right? So we're really, really, I think, as a community, very grateful to you and to your team for the incredible work that you do, for your juggling act, and for really reflecting and representing and listening to us and letting us express our point of view. So thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you very much for being candid with us and for sharing so much of what goes on in the paper and what you're thinking about for the future. I think we could have talked for much longer, but time is limited, and I'm going to thank you tonight and flick back to Bren to wrap us up tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ginette. Thank you very much.
Well, Ginette and Zeddy, that was absolutely fantastic. What a conversation. Thank you, Zeddy, so much for your time this evening. You said earlier that another part of your house was flooded, so thank you for taking time out of bailing out your flooded basement or living room, whatever it was, in order to join with us. That was a great conversation. There were so many questions, many questions that we didn't get to. I have them all here, and I don't quite know what I'll do with them. I'll throw them at Zeddy, who I'm sure is not busy at all during the weekend. Would love to take the time